The graphite snapped, a sound no louder than a dry twig breaking, but in the dead silence of the third-floor boardroom, it was a gunshot. I froze. My sketchbook lay open, exposing the harsh, heavy charcoal lines I'd just dragged across the page. It wasn't a doodle. It was the man at the head of the table. Victor Hayes, our CEO, an alpha whose scent of bruised cedar and cold iron was already pooling around my ankles. He wasn't looking at the quarterly projections. He was looking at me. The AC unit in Conference Room B always rattled. It was a low, persistent hum that vibrated right behind my molars, syncing perfectly with the dull ache of my suppressant patches. I hated Tuesdays. Tuesdays meant full department alignment meetings. It meant 30 bodies crammed into a space designed for 15, the air thick with the competing scents of nervous betas and overcompensating alphas. I sat at the very back, wedged between a drooping potted ficus and Chloe from accounting, whose lavender perfume was doing nothing to mask the sour tang of my own anxiety. I'm an Omega. In the corporate hierarchy of Hayes Media, that roughly translates to a glorified footnote. I designed the promotional banners. I made the fonts look nice. I kept my head down, swallowed my pills, and tried to ignore the biological imperative that made my skin itch whenever a dominant scent rolled through the ventilation. And then there was Victor Hayes. He stood at the front of the room, pointing a laser at a line graph that meant nothing to me. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my annual rent. He didn't pace. He didn't fidget. He commanded the space with a stillness that was deeply aggravatingly arrogant. I didn't want to draw him. I really didn't. But my hands have a habit of moving when my brain tries to check out. I had my moleskin propped up against a stack of unread marketing reports. My 4B pencil moved over the tooth of the paper, catching the aggressive line of his jaw, smudging the shadow under his cheekbone. I wasn't drawing a flattering portrait. I was drawing the tension in his shoulders, the rigid, unforgiving architecture of a man who owned everything he looked at. I darkened the hollow of his throat, pressing the lead and hard punishing the paper. Scratch, smudge, drag. It was a physical release. A way to anchor myself against the low-level nausea of being in a room steeped in his scent. Hayes smelled like an incoming storm ozone, wet earth, and something sharply metallic. It made the back of my neck prickle. It made me want to bare my throat, which made me want to punch a wall. So I drew instead. I was working on the predatory tilt of his eyes when the lead gave way. Snap! The fragment of graphite shot across the polished mahogany table. It hit the glass of Chloe's water bottle with a distinct tink. The drone of the marketing director stopped. The rattling AC suddenly sounded deafening. I didn't look up. I stared at the broken tip of my pencil, my stomach dropping through the floorboards. Slowly, I dragged my eyes up from the ruined sketch, past the blur of 30 turned heads, straight to the front of the room. Victor Hayes had stopped talking. His hands were braced on the podium. His eyes, pale glacial gray, were locked on me. He didn't look angry. He looked entirely uncomfortably curious. "Mr. Gallagher," Hayes said. His voice didn't boom. It didn't need to. It was a low baritone that vibrated right through the cheap carpet and up the soles of my boots. "Is there something on that page more pressing than the Q3 rollout?" My throat closed. The suppressants usually kept my scent muted, something like old paper and bitter tea, but panic is a universal language. I could smell the spike of my own fear, sharp and acrid. "No, sir." I managed my voice, cracking slightly. I snapped the book shut. The sound was too loud. "Just taking notes." Hayes tilted his head. A slow, deliberate movement. The air in the room seemed to compress the atmospheric pressure, dropping so fast my ears popped. He knew I was lying. Everyone knew I was lying. "Bring it here." The silence was absolute. Chloe shifted away from me, her chair squeaking. "Sir," I whispered. "Your notebook, Silas. Bring it to the front." He knew my name. Why the hell did the CEO know the name of a mid-level graphic designer? I stood up. My knees felt like water. Every instinct in my chemically suppressed biology screamed at me to submit, to roll over, to apologize. I fought it down with a surge of bitter resentment. I grabbed the sketchbook, my knuckles white. and walked the length of the room. The carpet felt like quicksand. When I reached the front, the smell of him was overwhelming. Up close, the ozone scent wasn't just a smell, it was a physical weight. It made my lungs tight. I held out the black book. I didn't look at his face. I looked at the knot of his silk tie. Hayes didn't take the book. He reached out and flipped the cover open while it was still in my hands. His fingers brushed mine. They were warm. Too warm. I flinched, pulling back a fraction of an inch, a pathetic display of prey instincts. He looked down at the sketch. It was raw. It was messy. It made him look like a hungry, caged animal in a tailored suit. Seconds stretched into hours. I waited for the pink slip. I waited for the humiliation. Hayes slowly closed the book. He didn't hand it back. He set it on the podium next to his tablet. "Take a seat, Mr. Gallagher," he said, his voice flat. "We'll discuss your notes in my office. 5 o'clock. He turned back to the screen. The meeting resumed. I walked back to my seat without my book, without my dignity, and with the sudden terrifying certainty that my life was about to become deeply complicated. By 4:55 p.m., I had packed my desk into a single cardboard box. My mug, 3 dying succulents, a handful of Micron pens. It didn't take much to erase 4 years of my life. I stared at the box, chewing the inside of my cheek until I tasted copper. I wasn't just fired. I was going to be humiliated by an alpha who got off on power plays. At 4:58 p.m., I stepped into the private elevator. The doors slid shut with a pneumatic hiss, sealing me in a steel box. The button for the 40th floor was already lit. My stomach did a slow, nauseating roll as the car ascended. The pressure in my ears built, blocking out the sound of my own erratic breathing. I reached up and pressed a hand over the scent gland on my neck, a defensive habit. The suppressant patch felt rough against my skin, peeling slightly at the edges. I was sweating. The tape was giving way. Great. Let him smell how terrified you are. The doors opened. The top floor didn't look like an office. It looked like a museum. Dark, hardwood, floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the gray sprawl of the city, and a silence so thick it felt like velvet. There were no assistants, just a long corridor leading to a set of heavy frosted glass doors. I walked toward them, my boots sounding too loud. Before I could knock, the voice came through the glass. "Come in." I pushed the door open. Victor Hayes was sitting behind a desk that looked like a slab of solid obsidian. He had taken his jacket off. His sleeves were rolled up to the elbows, exposing forearms corded with muscle and dusted with dark hair. It was a jarringly human detail on a man who usually looked like he was carved from marble. My sketchbook was sitting dead center on his desk. "Close the door, Silas." I did. It latched with a heavy final click. The moment it did, the air changed. The ventilation up here wasn't recycling the mass anxiety of the lower floors. It was just him. Pure, unfiltered alpha. The scent of ozone and crushed cedar hit the back of my throat. My knees actually gave out for a fraction of a second. I caught myself locking my joints, my face burning with shame. Hayes watched me. He didn't miss the stumble. His eyes dark in the overcast light filtering through the window tracked the movement of my hand as it dropped from my neck. "Sit." I walked over and sank into the leather chair opposite him. It was too soft. It made me feel like I was sinking, trapping me. "I have my things boxed up," I said. My voice was raspy. I cleared my throat, hating how defensive I sounded. "If you need me to sign severance paperwork, I can do it now." Hayes didn't reply immediately. He reached out and traced the spine of my sketchbook with a blunt fingertip. "You think I brought you up here to fire you over a drawing?" "It's insubordination," I said, reciting the HR manual like a shield. "Misuse of company time." And it was disrespectful. Disrespectful. He repeated the word slowly, tasting it. He opened the book to the page. "You think this is disrespectful?" "It's not a flattering caricature, Mr. Hayes." "It's not a caricature at all," he countered. He picked up the book and turned it around so I was forced to look at it. "You didn't draw a cartoon. You drew me looking at the quarterly reports, and you made me look like I was deciding which board member to butcher first." I swallowed hard. Like I said, disrespectful. Accurate, Hayes corrected softly. He dropped the book back onto the desk. It was exactly what I was thinking. I blinked. The cynical defensive wall I had spent the last 4 hours building suddenly had a crack in it. What? I don't care about the marketing banners, Silas. I don't care about the fonts. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. The proximity made my chest tighten. I care that you sat in a room full of people desperate to impress me and you were the only one who actually saw me. I didn't know how to process that. My brain, accustomed to corporate hostility, stalled. So, I'm not fired? No. Then why am I here? Hayes looked at me. Really looked. His gaze dragged from my eyes down to my jaw, lingering for a microsecond on the edge of the medical tape peeking over my collar. A low, almost imperceptible rumble started in his chest. An alpha purr. It was a sound you felt more than heard. It hit my suppressed biology like a wrecking ball. My breathing hitched. I want you to paint me, he said. I stared at him. Paint you? Yes. Like a corporate portrait. For the lobby. No. He leaned back the leather of his chair, groaning. Not for the lobby, for me. Once a week, Thursday evenings, up here. I'm a digital designer, I argued, panic flaring again. I use a tablet. That was just a charcoal sketch to keep my hands busy. You have oil paint stains on your boots. He interrupted, his voice dropping into a register that commanded obedience. Cadmium red, if I'm not mistaken. You smell like turpentine underneath the chemical trash you use to hide your scent. I froze. No one noticed the paint, and absolutely no one commented on my scent. It was deeply invasive. My biology is none of your business. I snapped the words out of my mouth before I could stop them. The silence stretched. I waited for the anger. I waited for the reprimand. But Hayes just looked fascinated. I will pay you triple your current hourly rate for those 3 hours a week, he said, entirely unfazed by my outburst. You will bring your canvases here. You will paint what you see. No flattery, no corporate filters. Why? I demanded, my hands gripping the armrests. You can hire any professional portrait artist in the city. Why me? Hayes stood up. He walked around the desk. I shrank back into the chair, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. He stopped right beside me, leaning against the edge of the desk. The fabric of his trousers brushed my knee. I stopped breathing entirely. Because the professionals try to paint an alpha, he said, his voice a low scrape next to my ear. You painted a monster. I want to see how the monster evolves. He stepped away, leaving me gasping for air in the vacuum he left behind. Thursday, 7 p.m. Bring your oils, Silas. Thursday evening felt like walking into a firing squad. The offices were empty. The fluorescent lights on the lower floors had been switched to a dim motion sensor glow. I carried a canvas under one arm and a wooden tackle box of paints in the other. They were heavy, cutting off the circulation in my fingers, but I welcomed the physical ache. It grounded me. I took the elevator up to the 40th floor. My hands were shaking. I had taken an extra half dose of suppressants at noon. My head was pounding a dull, rhythmic throb behind my left eye. The chemical taste of the pills coated the back of my throat, metallic and bitter. I pushed open the heavy glass doors to Hayes' suite. The lighting was different. The harsh overheads were off. The room was bathed in the amber glow of floor lamps and the dying, bruised purple light of the city sunset filtering through the glass. Victor was standing by the window, holding a crystal glass with an inch of amber liquid in it. He had discarded the tie. The top 2 buttons of his shirt were undone. The rigid armor of the CEO was gone, replaced by something looser, darker, and infinitely more dangerous. Set up near the window, he said, not turning around. I didn't speak. I dropped my box onto the carpet with a dull thud and unfolded my travel easel. The mechanical sounds, the snap of hinges, the scraping of wood felt loud and clumsy in the hushed room. I squeezed dollops of paint onto my wooden palette. Titanium white raw, umber burnt sienna, ivory black. The familiar pungent smell of linseed oil and turpentine bloomed in the air. For a second, it masked the scent of him. "Where do you want me?" he asked, finally turning. I squeezed a rag in my hand, staring at the blank canvas. "Just sit in the chair. Normal." He walked over to a leather armchair and sat. He didn't pose. He just existed. Legs spread slightly, one arm resting on the armrest, the glass dangling from his fingers. He looked exhausted, the lines around his mouth carved deep by the shadows. I picked up a stick of willow charcoal to rough out the composition. Look at me." I murmured more to myself than to him. He lifted his chin, his gray eyes locking onto mine. The impact was physical. It felt like I had stepped on a live wire. My hand jerked the charcoal, snapping against the canvas, leaving a dark, jagged smudge. Damn it. I took a shaky breath, forcing my shoulders down. I started to map the geometry of his face, the sharp angle of his jawline, the heavy brow, the way the light caught the bridge of his nose. The silence in the room wasn't empty. It was pressurized. Every time I looked up at him, I felt the biological pull, the innate genetic urge to lower my eyes, to bare my neck, to seek approval. I fought it with every scratch of the charcoal. I poured my resentment into the canvas. I made his jaw too rigid. I made the shadows under his eyes look like bruises. "You're angry." Victor's voice broke the silence, a low rumble that vibrated against the glass windows. I stopped mid-stroke. "I'm focusing." "You're holding that charcoal like you want to stab me with it." He took a sip of his drink. The ice clinked. "Why are you angry, Silas?" "I'm not. Your scent says otherwise." My stomach clenched. "My scent is suppressed." "Your scent is suppressed to a beta's olfactory range," he corrected smoothly. "I am an alpha. I can smell the chemical garbage you patch yourself with. But underneath it right now, you smell like burnt sugar and panic. And anger." My face flushed hot. It felt like he was stripping me naked. "I don't want to be here." "I'm paying you an exorbitant amount of money to be here." "Money doesn't make it comfortable." I snapped, tossing the charcoal onto the tray and picking up a bristle brush. I dug it into the raw umber, mixing it with turpentine until it was a thin, aggressive wash. "You're a CEO. I'm an Omega employee. You dragged me up here to perform a parlor trick because you like to doodle. It's an abuse of power." I waited for the axe to fall. I had just accused my boss of a power trip. Victor let out a soft breath that might have been a laugh. He set his glass down on the side table. "You think this is about power?" he asked, his voice suddenly very quiet. "Isn't it always—" I slashed the brush across the canvas, blocking in the dark shadow of his neck. "If I wanted a power trip, Silas, I would have fired you on Tuesday." He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. The movement brought him closer. His scent spiked the ozone, growing heavy, thick, like the air right before a lightning strike. "I brought you here because for the first time in 10 years, someone looked at me without wanting something from me. You didn't want a promotion. You didn't want my money. You just looked at me and saw exactly how ugly I feel." My hand stalled. The brush hovered inches from the canvas. I looked at him. The arrogant, untouchable CEO was gone. In the dim amber light, he just looked like a man carrying a weight that was crushing his spine. The alpha aura wasn't a weapon right now. It was a cage. My chest ached. It wasn't the suppressants. It was something else, something deeper, a sickening, pathetic twist of empathy that I couldn't afford. "Keep painting," he whispered, his eyes never leaving mine. I swallowed the lump in my throat. I dipped my brush into the shadows, and for the first time I didn't paint a monster. I painted the cage. By the fifth Thursday, the silence in the penthouse had changed. It wasn't the suffocating, heavily pressurized vacuum of the first week. It had thawed into something functional. A working silence broken only by the scrape of my palette knife, the wet sound of a brush washing in the turpentine jar, and the occasional clink of ice in Victor's glass. The painting was taking over my life. It bled into my daylight hours. I would sit in my cubicle on the third floor staring at a vectorized logo for a dog food brand, and all I could see was the exact ratio of alizarin crimson to ivory black. I needed to capture the shadow beneath Victor's collarbone. I was sleeping less. The dull ache behind my eyes was a permanent fixture right alongside the low-grade nausea from my daily suppressant patches. It was raining outside, a relentless gray city downpour that sheeted against the floor-to-ceiling glass of the 40th floor. The amber lamps were on. I was working on his hands. They were difficult hands to paint. Broad knuckles, blunt nails, the subtle map of veins pressing against the skin. Hands that signed away millions of dollars, hands that could probably break my neck with a twitch. "You're squinting," Victor said. I paused, my brush hovering over the canvas. I wiped the back of my wrist across my forehead. "The light is dying. The rain makes it too flat." Victor didn't argue. He stood up. The leather armchair gave a long, releasing groan. He walked over to the wet bar tucked into the far corner of the suite. I watched his reflection in the dark, rain-streaked glass. He moved with a heavy, deliberate grace that always made my chest feel uncomfortably tight. A moment later, a ceramic mug was set down on the side table next to my easel. Steam curled from the rim. "Earl Grey," Victor said, stepping back just enough to give me breathing room, but not enough to let me forget he was there. "You look like you're going to pass out." I stared at the mug. It was a bizarre intrusion of domesticity in a room that smelled like ozone and oil paint. "I'm fine, just tired." "Drink it, Silas." It wasn't a request. The subtle drop in his voice, that alpha resonance, made the hair on my arms stand up. I set my palette down. My hands were stained with burnt umber and small streaks of titanium white. I picked up the mug. It was scalding hot. The bergamot scent cut through the chemical smell of my paints clean and sharp. I took a sip. It was perfect. Not too bitter steep, just long enough. "Thank you," I muttered, looking at the floorboards. "You've barely touched the canvas in 20 minutes, he observed. He was standing close enough that the fabric of his trousers brushed the leg of my easel. "You're just staring at my hands." My face flushed. The suppressants kept my scent from spiking, but they couldn't stop the blood from rushing to my cheeks. "I'm figuring out the underpainting. Skin tones are complicated under this lighting." "Are they?" "Yes." I took another sip of the tea, desperate for something to do with my mouth. "Your knuckles cast weird shadows." He stepped up beside me. We were shoulder to shoulder looking at the half-finished painting. I held my breath. The smell of him crushed cedar wet pavement static electricity was overpowering. It pushed against my skin, demanding entry, demanding submission. My omega biology clawed at the back of my mind, a frantic, pathetic instinct urging me to tilt my neck to seek comfort in the sheer gravity of his presence. I gripped the mug tighter, letting the heat burn my palms to stay grounded. "It's not a corporate portrait," Victor murmured, his eyes scanning the wet oils. "I told you I wouldn't flatter you." "You didn't." He pointed a blunt finger at the canvas hovering an inch above the wet paint. "You made me look exhausted." "You are exhausted." I replied, the words slipping out before my corporate filter could catch them. Victor slowly turned his head to look at me. The proximity was startling. I could see the individual lashes framing his pale gray eyes. I could see the faint, uneven stubble on his jaw. "And what else am I, Silas?" he asked softly. The air in the room stopped moving. The drumming of the rain against the glass faded into static. I swallowed, my throat clicking audibly. "You're lonely," I said. It was a stupid, reckless thing to say to a billionaire CEO. It was career suicide. But looking at the canvas, looking at the bruised purples and hollow browns I'd instinctively used around his eyes, it was the only truth I had. Victor didn't yell. He didn't fire me. He just stared at me, his pupils dilating a fraction of a millimeter. The scent of ozone spiked heavy and suffocating before he abruptly stepped back, severing the tension like a cut wire. "Drink your tea." He set his voice flat, completely devoid of the resonance from a moment ago. "Then finish the hands. We're done for tonight." The following week was a nightmare. We were launching a new digital campaign, which meant 70-hour work weeks, cold takeout, and stress levels that had the entire third floor smelling like sour milk and burnt hair. My supply of suppressants was running low. I was relying on the patches sticking a fresh one to the hollow of my throat every morning, ignoring the raw, angry red rash developing underneath the adhesive. By Thursday evening, I was operating on 3 hours of sleep and pure caffeinated spite. I dragged myself up to the 40th floor at 7 p.m. sharp. My boots felt like they were filled with concrete. The box of paints weighed a ton. Victor was already seated in the armchair when I walked in. He had a file folder open on his lap, but he tossed it onto the coffee table the second the glass doors clicked shut. His eyes locked onto me, tracking my slow, heavy steps across the room. "You look awful," he said by way of greeting. "Good evening to you too, Mr. Hayes," I rasped. My voice sounded like gravel. I dropped the paint box. It hit the floor harder than I intended, the wood cracking sharply. I winced, the sound sending a spike of pain through my temples. I set up the easel, my fingers clumsy and uncoordinated. I dropped my tube of yellow ochre twice before I managed to unscrew the cap. The room was too warm. The heating must have been cranked up. Sweat prickled at my hairline. I reached up and pulled at the collar of my shirt, trying to get some air against the damp skin of my neck. As I dragged the brush across the palette, a sharp, stinging itch flared under my jaw. The patch, the sweat, and the cheap adhesive were giving way. I pressed a hand to my neck, trying to smooth it down, but the edge was already curling up, peeling away from the inflamed skin. A tiny, microscopic leak, but in a room with an alpha, it was the equivalent of a flare gun. Victor went perfectly still. I froze, the brush gripped in a white-knuckle fist. The metallic, bitter scent of the synthetic hormones was suddenly pierced by something else, something organic. The smell of burnt sugar, a dark, rich caramel note that belonged to me. It hit the air, curling outward, desperate and tired, and undeniably Omega. "Silas," Victor said. His voice was a low scrape of gravel. "I'm fine." I lied, my heart suddenly hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I scrubbed the brush into the canvas, ruining the blend I'd just made. "Just the heat in here. It's too hot." I reached up again, pressing desperately at the patch, trying to seal the chemical dam. My fingers were shaking. The rash burned. I heard the leather chair creak, then the heavy, measured sound of his footsteps. "Stay back." I snapped, a surge of pure animal panic overriding my common sense. I backed up, my hip hitting the easel. The canvas wobbled dangerously. Victor stopped 3 feet away. He wasn't looking at my eyes. He was looking at my throat. The ozone scent rolling off him wasn't aggressive. It was thick, heavy, and overwhelmingly protective. It was an involuntary biological response to an Omega in distress, and it made my knees weak. "Your patch is failing," he said quietly. "I know. I'm fixing it." I dug my fingernails into my neck, trying to force the tape down. It wouldn't stick. The sweat had ruined it. The smell of burnt sugar was getting stronger, sweetening the heavy static air of the penthouse. "Stop clawing at yourself," Victor commanded gently. "You're making it bleed." "I need to go." I choked out, dropping my brush. It hit the carpet, leaving a smear of brown paint. "I need to go down to my locker. I have pills." I took a step toward the door. My legs felt hollow. The sudden drop in artificial hormones, combined with the sheer exhaustion of the week, hit my nervous system like a freight train. The room tilted. The amber light smeared into a long, blurry streak. I stumbled. Victor closed the distance before I hit the floor. His hands clamped onto my arms, one on my bicep, one on my waist. The heat of him burned through the thin cotton of my shirt. "I've got you," he rumbled right next to my ear. The vibration of his voice sank directly into my bones. The fight drained out of me instantly. It was terrifying how fast my biology surrendered. My head dropped forward, my cheek resting against the solid, immovable plane of his chest. He smelled like cedar and safety. It was a lie, a chemical trick, but right then I didn't care. "I need my pills," I whispered into his shirt. "You need to breathe," he corrected. He didn't let go. He didn't pull me closer either. He just held me up, a solid structural support. "You're having a withdrawal spike. Just breathe, Silas." I squeezed my eyes shut. my fingers knotting into the fabric of his expensive suit jacket. We stood there in the middle of the silent room, the rain beating against the glass, my ruined scent spilling out, entangling hopelessly with his. I didn't go back to the third floor that night. After my knees stopped shaking, Victor guided me to the leather sofa. He went into his private adjoining bathroom and came back with a warm, damp towel. Without asking, without a single word of corporate posturing, he sat beside me, peeled the ruined patch from my throat, and carefully wiped away the blood and adhesive. His touch was terrifyingly gentle. I sat perfectly rigid, staring at the coffee table, my heart doing erratic, painful thuds against my sternum. The scent of burnt sugar was everywhere now. I was completely unmasked, naked in the one way that mattered. "Keep it off for tonight," he had said, tossing the soiled towel onto a tray. "Let your skin breathe." That was 20 minutes ago. Now I was back at the easel. I felt raw, exposed. Every scrape of the brush felt too loud. The air between us was permanently altered. It was thick with my natural scent and the heavy grounding weight of his. We weren't CEO and employee right now. We were just biology. I was painting the final details, the harsh line of his jaw, the deep, isolated shadow in his eyes. "Why do you suppress it so heavily?" Victor asked. He was back in his chair watching me. He hadn't picked up his file folder. I dragged a dry brush across the wet oil, softening a highlight. "Because I work in a corporate office with 30 other people. If I smell like this, they don't see a graphic designer. They see a liability. They see someone who needs to be protected or dominated or managed. I don't see a liability. You're paying me to paint you." I shot back, a defense mechanism flaring up. "You don't have to manage me. I'm paying you because you see things clearly," Victor said. He stood up again. I tensed, half expecting him to close the distance, but he walked over to the windows, staring out at the blurred city lights. "I took this company over from my father 7 years ago. Since then, I haven't had a single conversation where the other person wasn't calculating my net worth, my market share, or my genetic disposition." He turned back to look at me. The amber light caught the sharp angles of his face, the exact angles I had just spent 3 hours mixing colors for. "You hate me," he stated. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation. My hand stopped. I looked at him, then back at the canvas. Did I hate him? I hated what he represented. I hated the power he held over my life, my paycheck, my Thursday nights. I hated how my body reacted to his scent. But I looked at the painting. It was nearly finished. And it wasn't the portrait of a man I hated. The monster I'd drawn in the boardroom was gone. In its place was a man weighed down by an invisible crown. The colors were dark, yes, moody. But the brushstrokes around his eyes were unbearably soft. I had painted the exhaustion, the loneliness, the quiet, desperate humanity of an alpha who had forgotten how to be a person. I had painted him with empathy, and that terrified me more than anything else. "I don't hate you," I whispered. The words felt like broken glass in my throat. Victor walked toward me. He didn't stop at a polite distance this time. He stepped right up to the easel, completely invading my space. He looked at the painting for a long time. The silence stretched until it felt like a physical pressure on my chest. "You see it, don't you?" He murmured, his eyes scanning the wet oils. "See what you put on the canvas?" He reached out his hand, hovering over the portrait. He traced the air above the painted version of his own face, right over the soft, vulnerable lines I had tried to hide in the shadows. "You didn't paint a CEO." He dropped his hand and turned his head. He was so close I could feel the heat radiating from his skin. The smell of ozone and wet earth wrapped around my burnt sugar scent, consuming it, blending with it until I couldn't tell where I ended, and he began. "You painted a man you want to save?" he said softly. My breath hitched. I took a step back, bumping hard into the windowsill behind me. "That's not... Don't lie to me, Silas." He interrupted, his voice dropping into a register that made my spine melt. "Not when you've already told me the truth right here." He tapped the wooden frame of the canvas. I looked up at him. The clinical detached mask I wore every day was shattered. My throat was bare smelling of caramel and fear, and the cynical wall I had built between us was effectively demolished. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice cracking, sounding terribly small in the massive room. Victor stepped closer, trapping me against the window. He didn't touch me. He didn't have to. The sheer force of his presence pinned me in place. "I want you to stop hiding," he said. "I want you to stop hiding." The words hung in the air, heavy and loaded, competing with the scent of ozone and the steady drumming of the rain against the glass. I was pressed so tightly against the windowsill the cold edge bit into my spine. My lungs forgot how to pull oxygen. I looked at Victor's chest right where his tie used to be. I could see the slow, measured rise and fall of his breathing. He wasn't crowding me to force a submission. He was crowding me to make sure I couldn't look away from the truth. "I'm not hiding," I managed, though my voice betrayed me with a pathetic tremor. "I'm surviving." "Is that what you call it?" Victor reached out. I flinched, my eyes snapping shut, but the blow didn't come. Instead, the knuckles of his index and middle fingers brushed lightly against my jaw, avoiding the raw, inflamed skin of my scent gland. The touch was warm, slightly calloused, and devastatingly gentle. "You numb yourself with chemicals. You sit in the back of the room. You paint beautiful, vicious things in a black book that you never show anyone," he murmured. His fingers trailed down to my collarbone, hooking lightly under the fabric of my shirt. "You're a ghost, Silas. A ghost who smells like burnt sugar and rage." I opened my eyes. He was looking at me with a hunger that had absolutely nothing to do with corporate acquisitions. "If I stop hiding," I whispered, the fight completely drained out of me, "they'll tear me apart down there. You know how this world works. An omega in a corporate ecosystem is just prey." "You're not prey," Victor said, his voice hardening, the alpha resonance returning in a low protective hum that vibrated straight through my boots. "And no one in this building will touch you, not while I breathe." It was a primitive promise. It was the exact kind of territorial alpha bullshit I had spent my entire adult life mocking. But hearing it from him, feeling the sheer, undeniable gravity of his scent wrapping around me like a physical shield, my knees actually gave out. Victor caught me by the elbows before I could slide down the glass. He stepped back, pulling me with him, severing the trap he had created. He let go as soon as I had my balance. "Clean your brushes," he said, turning his back to me and walking over to the bar. He poured 2 fingers of scotch. His hand, the hand I had spent 3 hours painting, was remarkably steady. "Go home. Sleep. Take Friday off." "I have a deadline." "I am the CEO, Silas. Your deadline is moved to Monday." He downed the scotch in one swallow. "And throw the patches away. If you need a medical suppressant, get a prescription pill. Stop burning your own skin." I didn't argue. I packed my wooden box in a daze. My hands were stained with umber and white, my neck was bare, and the air in the penthouse felt permanently altered. When I stepped into the elevator and the doors hissed shut, the sudden absence of his scent hit me like a physical blow. I leaned against the steel wall, breathing hard, smelling nothing but my own sweet, ruined panic. Friday was a blur of sleep and withdrawal. By Monday morning, the reality of the 3rd floor hit me like a bucket of dirty water. I walked out of the elevator at 8:45 a.m. I was wearing a thick cotton turtleneck to hide the healing rash on my throat. I had taken a prescription oral suppressant, a mild one, barely enough to mute the edge of my scent, but enough to keep me from sending the whole floor into a frenzy. I smelled like faded caramel. It wasn't the metallic void the patches provided, but it was manageable. The moment I sat at my desk, the difference was palpable. The dull, persistent headache I'd lived with for 4 years was gone. The colors on my monitors looked sharper, but the trade-off was sensory overload. I could smell everything. The stale, burnt coffee in the break room. The sharp, peppery anxiety of the beta copywriters stressing over ad copy. And the heavy, sour musk of the floor manager, a mid-tier alpha named Trent. Trent liked to loom. He walked the aisles with his chest puffed out, a walking HR violation, who used his biology to get graphic designers to work through lunch. At 10 a.m., he stopped at my cubicle. "Gallagher," Trent barked, leaning his heavy forearms on the top of my partition. He He smelled like cheap cologne masking stale sweat. I instantly felt my stomach turn. Where were you Friday? The dog food banners are late. They're rendering, I said, keeping my eyes on my screen. I didn't hunch my shoulders. I didn't make myself small. Mr. Hayes authorized the extension. Trent scoffed a wet, ugly sound. Hayes doesn't even know you exist, Omega. Don't lie to me. He stepped into my cubicle. The space was suddenly too small. His scent flared a deliberate, aggressive push meant to force me to lower my eyes. A week ago I would have. I would have felt the chemical patch burning my neck, apologized, and worked until midnight. But I wasn't wearing the patch. And I had spent the last month sitting 3 feet away from an alpha whose presence made Trent feel like a loud, annoying gnat. I turned my chair to face him. I looked him dead in the eye. The files will be in your inbox by noon. Trent. I said, my voice eerily calm. Trent's eyes narrowed. He took a step closer, inhaling sharply. He finally noticed the change. His nose wrinkled. What the hell is that smell? Are you off your blockers? You smell like a bakery. It's distracting. Then go back to your desk, I replied flatly. He flushed his face, turning an angry mottled red. Listen to me, you little... Is there a problem here, Mr. Peterson? The voice didn't yell. It didn't need to. It sliced through the hum of the office like a straight razor. The entire floor went dead silent. The clicking of 30 keyboards stopped simultaneously. Trent froze. He slowly turned around. Victor Hayes was standing at the end of the aisle. He was flanked by the marketing director and the VP of sales, but they looked like afterthoughts. Victor wore a dark navy suit. His hands were in his pockets. He looked completely relaxed, but the air around him was vibrating with a silent, lethal static. I could smell the ozone from 30 feet away. It wasn't the calm, heavy storm from the penthouse. It was a lightning strike. Mr. Hayes. Trent stammered. The heavy, sour musk rolling off him instantly vanished, replaced by the sharp, acidic tang of pure terror. No, sir, no problem. Just checking on a deadline. Victor walked down the aisle. The VP and the director stayed rooted to their spots. As Victor moved the betas and lower alphas in the cubicles, instinctively leaned away, physically shrinking from the sheer density of his presence. He stopped right behind Trent. He was a full 3 inches taller than the floor manager. Mr. Gallagher's deadlines are perfectly managed, Victor said softly. He didn't look at Trent. He looked over Trent's shoulder directly at me. His pale gray eyes tracked over the high collar of my turtleneck, checking for the patch. Finding none, a minuscule fraction of the tension in his jaw released. Yes, sir. Of course. Trent mumbled, staring at the floorboards. Then why are you standing in his workspace? The phrasing was deliberate. His workspace. Victor wasn't just scolding a manager. He was laying a boundary line. It was an archaic, deeply biological display of territoriality wrapped in corporate jargon. The air pressure in the room dropped so fast, my ears popped. I was just leaving, sir, Trent practically whispered. He backed out of my cubicle, nearly tripping over a trash can in his haste to retreat down the aisle. Victor stood there for a moment. He looked at my monitors, the dog food banners I was supposedly rendering. He looked at the half-empty mug of tea on my desk. And then slowly he inhaled. I knew exactly what he was smelling. The faint, sweet scent of burnt sugar unmasked and present. A slow, terrifyingly soft smirk ghosted across Victor's lips. It was there and gone in a microsecond, meant only for me. See that you have those files to him by noon. Silas. Victor said, his tone entirely professional. Yes, Mr. Hayes. He turned and walked away, his entourage scrambling to catch up. I sat frozen in my chair. The entire floor remained dead silent for another 10 seconds after the elevator doors closed. Then the whispers started. A low, furious buzzing of gossip. Chloe from accounting poked her head over the partition, her eyes wide. Did he just call you Silas? She hissed. I dragged my hands over my face, pressing my palms against my eyes until I saw stars. I was furious. I was mortified. And God help me, underneath it all, my chest was glowing with a warm, pathetic, deeply ingrained satisfaction. I hated it. I hated that a biological switch in my brain was purring because the apex predator of the building had just bared his teeth to protect my cubicle. By Thursday evening, the tension in my own body was unmanageable. I took the elevator up to the 40th floor at 6:55 p.m. I brought a jar of Damar varnish and a wide, flat brush. The painting was dry enough for the final coat. It was the last session. The contract was over. I pushed through the glass doors. The penthouse was dark. The amber lamps were off. The only illumination came from the violent strobe-like flashes of a summer thunderstorm rolling across the city skyline. Rain was lashing the glass in heavy, angry sheets. Victor wasn't in the leather armchair. He was standing by the window, a dark silhouette against the fractured lightning. "Turn the lights on," I said, setting my wooden box on the floor. "I can't varnish in the dark." He didn't move to the light switch. He turned around. In the flash of lightning, I saw his face. The rigid mask of the CEO was gone entirely. He looked like the man I had painted. Hollowed out. Raw. "Leave it," he said. His voice was rough, scraping against the dark. I stood by the easel. The painting was resting there, a dark square in the gloom. I gripped the jar of varnish so tightly my fingers ached. "You made a scene on Monday." "I managed my staff." "You marked your territory." I shot back, the anger finally breaking through. "You humiliated him in front of the whole floor, and you made sure everyone knew I was under your umbrella. Do you know what the rumors are saying now?" "I don't care what they're saying." "Well, I do." I yelled, my voice cracking. The smell of burnt sugar spiked in the room, hot and furious. "I have to work down there. I'm an Omega Victor. I don't get the luxury of ignoring the politics. Now they think I'm sleeping my way to the top. They think I'm your pet." Victor moved. He didn't walk. He stalked. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, his boots silent on the thick carpet. I backed up, my spine hitting the cold metal of the easel, but I didn't lower my head. I glared up at him, my chest heaving. He stopped inches from me. In the dark, the scent of him was overwhelming. Ozone cedar, and something darker, something deeply possessive. It made my pulse hammer in my throat. "You are not a pet." Victor growled, his hands coming up to grip the metal frame of the easel on either side of my shoulders, trapping me. "You are the only person in this godforsaken building who doesn't treat me like a machine. You think I want to own you, Silas. I want you to look at me." "I am looking at you," I shouted back. "No, you're looking at the CEO. Look at me." He let go of the easel and brought his hands to my face. His palms were warm, his long fingers threading into my hair, holding my head still. His thumbs brushed the high, sharp line of my cheekbones. I froze. The fight evaporated from my lungs. Another flash of lightning illuminated the room. I saw the desperate, fractured look in his pale eyes. The cage I had painted. The exhaustion. "What do you want from me?" I whispered the exact same question I had asked weeks ago, but this time I wasn't demanding an answer. I was begging for one. "Everything you put on that canvas," Victor breathed, leaning down. His forehead rested against mine. "The anger, the pity, the ugliness. I want you to stay. I'm expensive." I breathed, my hands coming up defensively, meant to push against his chest. But the moment my palms met the solid hot wall of his torso, my fingers curled into the fabric of his shirt instead. I was anchoring myself to the storm. A low sound ripped from Victor's throat, a deep shuddering rumble that resonated straight into my bones. The alpha purr. It wasn't commanding this time. It was an acoustic surrender. "I'll bankrupt the company," he murmured against my mouth. Then he kissed me. It wasn't a corporate acquisition. It wasn't a gentle, polite collision. It was absolute ruin. His mouth was hot and demanding a desperate pressure that tasted like expensive scotch and raw desperation. The moment his lips parted mine, the last thread of my cynical, heavily guarded self-control snapped. I kissed him back with all the buried feral frustration of a man who had spent 4 years swallowing down his own nature. I opened my mouth to him, my hands sliding up from his chest to grip the heavy muscle of his shoulders. He tasted like a thunderstorm. The The sheer physical power of him was intoxicating. Victor groaned a harsh, guttural sound. He wrapped his arms around my waist, his large hand splaying flat against my lower back, and lifted me off the floor. I gasped into his mouth, my legs instinctually wrapping around his hips. The sudden loss of gravity should have terrified me, but the grip he had on me was unbreakable. He backed us up his boots heavy on the carpet until my back slammed into the solid, cool glass of the floor-to-ceiling window. Outside, the rain was a violent blur. Inside, the heat was suffocating. He broke the kiss, burying his face into the side of my neck. He didn't bite. He didn't mark. He just inhaled, taking in deep, ragged breaths of the bare, unpatched skin right over my scent gland. The smell of caramel and burnt sugar flared so intensely in the room, it almost tasted sweet on my tongue. "You smell like mine," he whispered against my pulse point, the stubble on his jaw scraping a delicious, agonizing friction against my sensitive skin. "I'm not something you own." I gasped, threading my fingers into his dark, neatly styled hair and ruining it, pulling his head back so I could look at him. His eyes were dilated, the gray irises swallowed entirely by black. He looked wrecked. He looked beautiful. "Then let me be yours," Victor answered. The words hit me like a physical blow. The CEO, the billionaire, the apex alpha of the entire corporate ecosystem, offering his throat to a third-floor graphic designer who had oil paint under his fingernails. The internal contradiction that had governed my entire life, the hatred of submission versus the biological craving for an alpha's weight, suddenly resolved itself. It wasn't about submission. It was about finding someone heavy enough to anchor you to the ground when the wind blew too hard. I pulled his mouth back down to mine. The kiss slowed, turning from a frantic collision into something deeper, something methodical. He tasted my bottom lip, his tongue tracing the seam, his hand slowly smoothing up my spine, tracing the vertebrae through the thin cotton of my turtleneck. Every place he touched felt branded. We stayed like that for a long time, tangled together against the glass, the thunderstorm raging around the 40th floor, reducing the rest of the world to meaningless noise. Eventually, my legs started to tremble from the strain of holding myself up. Victor felt it. He slowly lowered me down until my boots touched the carpet. He didn't let go, keeping one arm securely banded around my waist, keeping my chest flush against his. I rested my forehead against his collarbone, my breathing ragged. "The painting," I murmured after a long silence, my voice slightly raspy. "I still need to varnish it." Victor let out a soft huff of laughter that vibrated against my cheek. "Leave it. Let it dry another week." "It's dry now." "Then let it sit," he said softly, his hand coming up to cup the back of my neck, his thumb stroking a slow, rhythmic circle over my hairline. "Because if you finish it tonight, the contract is over, and you won't have a reason to come back up here on Thursdays." I pulled back just enough to look up at him. The storm was passing the lightning strikes further away now, casting a softer rolling light across his face. The shadows under his eyes were still there, but the cage around them was gone. "I don't need a contract to come upstairs," I said quietly. Victor's hand stopped moving on my neck. He stared down at me, a slow, profound relief washing over his features, making him look 5 years younger. "No," he agreed softly. "You don't." I stepped out of his embrace. The cool air of the room instantly rushed over the front of my shirt, a stark reminder of the heat I was leaving. I walked over to the easel. In the dim light from the city below, the portrait looked finished. The raw umber, the aggressive strokes of charcoal, the soft bruised purples around the eyes. I picked up my palette knife and a tube of ivory black. "What are you doing?" Victor asked, walking up behind me, his chest a hair's breadth from my back. "Editing," I said. I squeezed a tiny dot of black paint onto the edge of the knife. I leaned over the canvas and carefully, deliberately dragged the blade across the bottom right corner, covering up my signature. I dropped the knife onto the wooden tray. "It's ruined," I stated, turning around to face him. "Unfinished. I'm going to have to come back next week to fix the background. Probably the week after that, too." Victor looked from the blurred black smudge on the canvas to my face. The slow, devastating smile that spread across his mouth was worth every hour of lost sleep, every panic attack, every drop of turpentine. "Take all the time you need, Silas," he said, reaching out to pull me back into the dark. "I'm not going anywhere." And that's how a cynic accidentally negotiates a lifetime contract. No HR manual prepares you for the moment. The corporate apex predator decides your burnt sugar scent is the only thing keeping him sane. Silas walked into that penthouse expecting a pink slip, but walked out with the CEO's soul on a canvas. If this gritty high-stakes Omegaverse tension hit all the right notes for you, smash that like button. Share this video with someone who loves their alphas obsessive and their omegas unapologetic, and subscribe to the channel for more raw BL audio dramas. See you in the next one.